Good afternoon. It's Wednesday, the 10th of October 2018, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. Your host today, Mike Robinson, myself, Brian Gerrish. Delighted that we'll also be joined by Alex Thompson from the Netherlands with Eastern Approaches. Should we trust the banks, Mike?
No, let's get straight on with it. Well, the IMF's annual meeting is taking place at the moment in Bali. And the message is, well, we're all screwed, Brian. There's really not much else to say about that. That's pretty much it. The financial system is stronger, but new vulnerabilities have emerged in the decade since the crisis. That's the latest posting on the IMF blog. Well, they pushed out a nice little video. 10 years after the 2008 global financial crisis, the banking system is stronger, so we can all feel good about that. But today they held their press briefing for the Global Financial Stability Report, which was released last week in time for this conference. And they're talking about the huge rise in borrowing by corporates and government at cheap interest rates is not showing up in higher levels of research and development or more general investment in infrastructure. With global debt levels well above those at the time of the last crash in 2008, the risk remains that unregulated parts of the financial system could trigger a global panic. So that's sort of the message of it. Speaking earlier in the week, the lovely Christine Lagarde was warning about this. She said quantitative easing has led to a huge buildup of debt in emerging markets. This should serve as a wake-up call. She's talking about rising US interest rates could trigger a flight of funds and destabilize the economies of these so-called emerging markets. Well, here is the report, the Global Financial Stability Report. Well, here's a quote from it. Large challenges loom for the global economy to prevent a second Great Depression. Now, this is the first time they've really used this term, Great Depression, and I do wonder why they've chosen to use it right now. The question is, are they saying that if we don't, sort things out, we're going to head into a Great Depression? I think that's exactly what they're saying. I think that's exactly correct as well. But look, Christine Lagarde was talking about quantitative easing being the source of this problem. But that's only part of the thing. Let's come back to this still from that little video clip that we showed a second ago. 10 years after the 2008 global financial crisis, the banking system is stronger. And the bullet point there is with more oversight and more capital. And of course, this is exactly what the Bank of England has been talking about. Greater oversight, greater capital reserves from the banks. But what this demonstrates is they're still lying to people about the financial crash of 2007 and 2008, because Lehman Brothers didn't go out of business because it had a capital reserve problem. Lehman Brothers went out of business because it had a liquidity problem, and that's something completely different. They have not dealt with the liquidity problems that still exist within the banks at the moment, and we're seeing on an increasingly regular basis now these apparent collapses in bank IT systems, which means people can't access their money. And I'm going to say I have no particular evidence for this, but I do know for a fact that the IT systems that banks have are pretty resilient in general. And so I'm going to say that failures in banking IT systems are much more likely, in my mind, to be as a result of problems within the banks rather than problems with the IT systems themselves, problems with the banks meeting their obligations. So Lehman Brothers, as I say, did not go out of business because it had a capital reserve problem. Of course, as I say, Christine Lagarde talking about quantitative easing, she didn't say anything about quantitative tightening, which is what's going on at the moment. They're starting to pull in the reins once again. And of course, once you've got everybody indebted to a level where they can't repay, what happens when you start reining in on that? Collapse. Yeah. So I'm going to say that this is not a potential collapse or sort of speculative on the IMF's part. They know the collapse is coming because they're engineering it.
And it's amazing the terminology they're using. Looking at those slides as you put them on screen, Mike. The banks are in control. The banks are advising governments. Yet at the same time, they don't seem to be in control, and it's other people causing the problems that they are then having to deal with. The banks are exposed to indebted clients. So are they in control or are they not in control? Which are those two? They're in control.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. But anyway, let's look at one other area that they're in control, because Italy is causing trouble, and Italy has set some targets for its budget, which the European Union doesn't like very much. They're a serious source of concern for the European Commission. So the European Commission sent a letter. Let's just look at one little bit of it here. While waiting for the draft budgetary plan, we take note of the government's, that's the Italian government's intention in the updated EFD to revise its fiscal targets for 2019-21, targeting headline deficits of respectively 2.4, 2.1 and 1.8% of GDP, and to deviate from the previously announced convergence path towards Italy's medium-term objective of a balanced budget in structural terms. In other words, the European Union and the European Central Bank had imposed limits on what the Italian government could do with its economy. The current Italian government, this was arranged with the previous Italian government, the current Italian government is telling them to go to hell, and they're not very happy about it at all. Well, this of course has had the inevitable result. The markets have stepped in, and they've been attacking the bond market. So Italian bonds already only a couple of points above non-investment grade, so just a couple of points above junk status, and the EU talking about, and the European Central Bank talking about a downgrade on Italian debt. Over the last couple of days, it's been as wide as 3% yield on the bonds. So the Italian bonds under attack at the moment, and we'll see how this pans out. But certainly the current Italian government and the European Union not in a happy place together.
Everything the EU has touched, Mike, has turned out to be disaster.
Well, what's interesting is that, of course, this is the same type of tactics that the EU tried on Greece. They had more success, and eventually Greece capitulated, but Italy doesn't look like it's going to do any such thing. So my question is, will the European Union survive? Maybe this is a good time to bring Alex onto the programme. What are your thoughts on that, Alex? What are your thoughts on the Italian government's relationship with the EU at present, and particularly the Commission?
It's a very tricky one for the Commission to handle, Mike, because Italy, of course, is a founder member, and to being one of the defeated Axis powers of the Second World War, it, together with Germany, was brought into the defense structures and the coal and steel structures at a very early stage in the 1950s as one of the vanquished powers. Earning came from France and Britain and America, but Italy got roped in very, very early and started contributing its brains. And so it committed its whole ruling class and its technocratic class to the European centralization project right back in the 50s, when the European Economic Community was still referred to as Les Cinq, the Five. Even before the Germans were involved, the Italians were, and later the West Germans making Les Six. Very, very different situation from Greece, of course, which was under military dictatorship under junta until as late as 1982, and then only 4 years after that joined in 1986 the European Economic Community. The other difference with Italy is, well, yes, they both are very spirited countries with lots of backbone and lots of national sentiment that just will not go away. But the economic robustness is there in Italy. From Rome and upwards, you have basically a Germanic economy with plenty of savings, families, small businesses. It's pretty much the same way of doing business as you would find in Germany, Austria, the Netherlands, or Scandinavia. There's lots of assets held there, and a sense of cohesion, and businesses doing business with each other in a close network. Very different from Greece, where you have a great history of emigration and shipping companies and other kinds of less tangible assets. Italy has a dense infrastructure, and without it, the European Union is scuppered. To bring your question to a head, the European Commission is actually very delicately poised in its relations with Italy because of the closing of the border at Ventimiglia, the main road border between France and Italy. And Italian politicians, Matteo Salvini, the interior minister, but also others, have been saying, come on, France, open this border, because these are migrants, which, of course, mainly through Northern European NGOs trafficking, have come into Italy, and they're in Schengen land. They're supposed to be dispersed in the European Union's arrangements between the members, certainly of Schengenland. But France, of course, has temporarily suspended Schengen, just as the Danes have done at certain points on the German border, causing a great friction. You can't ask a European Commission to choose between France and Italy because these are two heavyweight founder members. And of course, we have some Italian history with Romano Prodi being the head of the most corrupt European Commission there ever was and having to resign with his commissioners in the early 2000s. And of course, he then went off to Goldman Sachs type work and eventually got parachuted back into Italian politics. Very, very complicated situation, really. But Italy, you cannot envisage any kind of European project surviving economic and political centralization if Italy is not in on it. It would just be a Franco-German double act then.
Okay, well, we watch with interest in that case. That's pretty interesting. Now, on Monday, we had Dilyana Gunjeva on the program from Bulgaria talking about alleged bioweapons programs in Georgia. And part of that, we showed a clip from her recent documentary. I just want to show 30 seconds of that to introduce this little section.
Certain zones of the laboratory are classified zones and are accessible only to American citizens with security clearance. They are accorded diplomatic immunity under the 2002 U.S.-Georgia Agreement on Defense Cooperation.
So, Alex, you had said to me that you had some additional information on that U.S.-Georgia Defense Agreement because this is kind of your area, elsewhere in that documentary, Dilyana had some comment from a previous president of Georgia saying, this is unprecedented, that there should be an area, a building within Georgia where it is impossible for Georgian citizens to go. And of course, it's that agreement that sets that situation up.
Yes, Mike, this is pretty much my area because I was on the GCHQ Georgia desk from 2001 to 2009. And very early on in my tenure there, the US suddenly surprised us all, including my colleagues at NSA and CIA. I hadn't seen this coming, the country experts there, with this announcement that there was going to be a GTEP, standing for Georgia Train and Equip program. And that is the context in which that 2002 treaty was signed, which Dilyana, in Patrick's narration there, features on screen. Now, I did something in preparation for today that I hadn't bothered to do, together with all the spooks and foreign policy wonks at the time. We never bothered to read the text of the thing, which Dilyana has gone and read. So I went to the US State Department's website and read it. And one surprise was that they had scanned in the Georgian text on one page upside down. It's a different alphabet. So that shows you how carefully the treaty had been scanned and handled by the US side. But Article 6 and also Article 10 there do say that there's two kinds of immunity involved in the proximate reason for Americans being there was for this anti-terrorist training mission because of the problems of Chechens in the Pankisi Gorge at the time. But then that basis has been left open-ended and has ended up with this situation where contractors are being given diplomatic immunity. The reason for that is that in the treaty it says that US military and government personnel can just get in and out of Georgia by flashing their US government card and mission orders, but contractors will be allowed in on a standard passport but no questions asked. And that seems to have been the basis for the diplomatic passport operations which are now being used. It is an unprecedented situation. It wasn't clear to the Georgian government or Western allies of Georgia at the time, other than a few deep staters in the US, I think, what was going on. And I suspect now in hindsight that treaty was drafted more by the contractors and their lobbyists than it was by the State Department diplomats and treaty specialists. It reads very loosely for and open-endedly for a treaty of that time. People may have forgotten that in 2002, there were these Chechen terrorists running around in Georgia in the area called the Pankisi Gorge. It was a very hot topic at the time. I remember a policy person telling me there are people in Whitehall who are het up about the Pankisi Gorge who don't even know that it's in Georgia. They just heard that it's a terrible problem. The Russians were pointing this out at the time. But it was the latest in a series of twists and turns of Georgia geopolitically, which would take too long to get into today. But at the root of this is from 1994 onwards, you see several waves of Chechen terrorists who turn out to have Western financial backing and the knowledge of some in the deep state in Britain and America, causing problems, and the Russians and the Americans saying we have to deal with this. Shevardnadze flipping during his tenure from the Russians to the Americans on this, but the constant is this undercurrent of we have to have an American security presence here to deal with these Chechens who then turn out to be there by the planning of certain people in the West. I wouldn't say that in the main structures. So that's been a pretext on the basis of which we're now 16 years on from that treaty, we find this laboratory situation. So that was a kind of an open-ended thought on the situation. But what I mean to say really by that is it seems that there's such long-term planning by the contractors involved that they may have actually brought about the situation pretty much a generation later. And they may have had this end result of using Georgians as lab rats in mind when the proximate cause of the terrorist fuss was kicking off in 2002. Which fizzled out like a damp squib.
Mm. Yeah. So I mean, is this tantamount to an occupation?
Georgia is pretty much occupied by the US because we've had this fanatically pro-US president come and go and even be indicted by the current government, the Margvelashvili government. That's why Saakashvili is now stateless and can't return to Georgia without being prosecuted. And yet the policy continues. There is still the putting the frighteners on journalists. Dilyana is still being threatened heavy-handedly by security guards and being locked in her hotel rooms. That's clearly being done by the elements of the Georgian security services, or at least with their tacit approval. And yet the current government is saying it wants rapprochement with Russia. So there has to be someone holding Georgia by curlies. And, you know, that there was a lot of corruption involved in that period around 2002 I was talking about, with all the main ministers, the security minister, the defense minister, the interior minister, they and their families implicated up to their eyeballs in financial and even worse kinds of crime. What seems to have happened is all the knowledge of that, certainly during my decade as GCHQ's Georgia expert, I could see these problems quietly being swept under the carpet. And I wouldn't blame the official Americans whose policy remit was Georgia. They were clean people, but the knowledge of how to blackmail the Georgians involved seems to have gone into a black hole somewhere off the books and is now being used to keep the Georgians in line.
Yes. Okay. Well, let's move on then. And well, on Monday, another subject we were talking about on Monday was the new joint vision document, which of course we haven't seen in full yet because it doesn't seem to have been published on the government British government website just yet. But there is Gavin Williamson and Ursula von der Leyen, the two the British and the German defence ministers, very happy together, signing their new joint vision. This is what Gavin had to say about it. If you remember, the statement signed today strengthens UK-German ties and bolsters the defence of two key NATO partners. This is an alliance we both hold dear. And the point I was making was, of course, it's not NATO that he's talking about there, Brian. It's the new alliance, the new European Union defence alliance that he's talking about. This is the one that he's particularly excited about. But anyway, Alex, I was keen to get your thoughts on this, particularly from the German perspective.
There has been coverage in German press, and more than I would have expected, because the Germans are in the driving seat of this EU military union project, and until now the order seems to have been to press not to cover it. But there has been quite a lot of coverage of it. The establishment's newspaper, the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, had a fairly lengthy coverage of it. But both they and the lesser titles which are covering it have very much the aim, the angle of this is really to ensure Europe's security. We have to make sure that there's continuity of counter-terrorism coverage, which has nothing to do with standard military or NATO links. Actually, it has to do with intelligence links, very little to do with NATO. So that's the curtain under which this is being presented. It's about training and equipping, which is exactly the excuse which the Americans used to get into Georgia: train and equip the locals to fight terrorists. That is being set up, certainly spun in the German press as the angle of German-British defence cooperation is that we're going to go into Europe's near abroad, Russia's underbelly, and teach them how to deal with counter-terrorism. So this does seem to be a changing of the guard from an American umbrella to a German security umbrella. But behind each of these incarnations, the American and the German, has been the British deep state, which we know about from the Gladio era as well. People can research that very easily. So we've got the British deep state and other actors saying, well, we're going to flip now from using the Americans as the security cover to using the Germans. I think that's the core game that's going on. But the effect, the tactics used will be the same, which is excuse to have a forward presence in the countries around Russia and China. That's certainly the angle that the German press is presenting.
Well, this was an example of the German press that you sent through to us from Westfalenblatt. Brian, you noticed something about this particular article?
Well, I did. Let's just bring up a different shot here because I believe many people say this is Gav the Chav with the lovely Ursula. I did find the fact that somebody was taking selfies with a pathetic, I think is the expression I'm going to use. But what I noticed in the photograph is that we had these men in black. And maybe these sort of people have been around in this environment before. But to me, I thought there's something different here. And they looked as if they'd stepped straight out of the movie. So what were we watching? And I believe you found us a little video.
Well, I have. Let's just have a look at this.
There are people working at NATO who are doing their best to keep the world safe. Our job is to keep them safe. Often people get the impression that a close protection agent should be a macho type, which is absolutely not the type of person who works in the NATO close protection unit. A close protection agent is trained for a lot of things, and they just need to be ready to be able to do what is expected in normal situations, in tense situations and in situations of a higher risk. We are constantly developing medical skills, studying and training on weapons, improving our driving skills and communication skills. There are many highly skilled female close protection agents, but unfortunately we don't have any working in the NATO close protection unit right now. We are actively recruiting for female agents. Working as a close protection agent for NATO is a great privilege. It's a high profile environment with high profile people, and you are protecting men and women who are really making an impact on the world.
So is that what we see in this image then, do you think?
I'm sure that that's exactly what we see. What an amazing video clip, because we're not interested in macho men. We're going to feature macho men in the advertising for this. We haven't got any women. We need some women, but don't worry. We're primarily trained as medics, is what came across. Alex, this is very dangerous stuff, because now around NATO, we're bringing in, this is almost like having Blackwater or Z straight alongside NATO.
Yes, Brian, and to keep on the alphabet, the letters of the alphabet, you mentioned Z. People in the chat box have said that some have said this is the A-team and others have said it's X-Men. So we're in there somewhere with the letters of the alphabet. I've never heard of NATO having its own close protection officers, and I would have expected, I would have heard of it, and I think you probably would have expected the same with the amount of experience we have of this issue. So it must be jolly new. They've got a Dutchman giving his lovely Dunglish narration. I don't know whether he is one of the officers, but they all look rather blonde and Dutch in the advert there. What seems to be going on is that they have, rather like the Russian Spetsnaz concept, they're drawing men from existing bodyguard and close protection units from police and military. So that is interesting, because NATO in Europe is supposedly winding down now in this German-British model and giving way to a German umbrella military union. Which is picking up the pace at the moment. And yet at the same point, the Europeans, the core Germanic countries that are going to form this, are saying, well, under the auspices of NATO, we're forming basically a VIP protection unit as a single superstate entity. So this looks an ideal way of putting something together which can then be handed off to the EU, dare I say.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, is that right? Because we actually don't know. I mean, we know that Stoltenberg and Mogherini have been spending a lot of time together, but we don't know exactly what the relationship is going to be, because they haven't said specifically what that relationship is going to be. And I see, as we also mentioned on Monday, Alex, NATO starting to look in civilian areas and also in areas of cyber. So I just wonder what and the fact that they're based in Brussels as well gives us a clue. So I just wonder what that future relationship is going to be. And I'm not sure that it's one of replacement necessarily.
No, I think the big word in Brussels is synergy, leveraging synergy. Let's remember that both Brussels and NATO are, EU and NATO are Brussels headquartered, although both organizations have quite important buildings and branches elsewhere. And so it pretty much is a question of scooting across the road. when EU and NATO do things together. There is going to be this synergy and some kind of, perhaps not redundancy or duplication, because that's another thing the German press is reporting. We must avoid duplication, but there will be complementarity to make the whole greater than the sum of its parts, I think. And it may be that it's more politically acceptable for the men holding the Glocks to be NATO, because that's accepted in people's minds as Europe's military front and a way of keeping the Ruskies out and so on. Whereas if you talk about an EU close protection unit, people might get the heebie-jeebies. In practice, there may not be much difference in terms of who's giving the orders.
Yeah. Okay. Well, Brian, we have received some mail.
Yeah, we've received a letter. It is an incredible letter, and we'd like to say a very big thank you to the gentleman who sent it through to us. We can't do it full justice today, but we'll at least introduce it and have a look at why it's so important. Let's bring it on screen. Here it is. And the first thing I'm going to highlight is where it's come from. It's come from the Euro-Atlantic Security Policy. And I find this rather an intriguing way of introducing a letter. Obviously, we can see from the address on the right-hand side that this is part of the Foreign Commonwealth Office, but it's the Euro-Atlantic Security Policy, which I had never heard of. So this letter really caught my eye this morning. It is a letter, I think, trying to calm the waters, because most of it is to do with spin and trying to get rid of pressure. So here it's starting off by saying that it's talking about PESCO and it's defending PESCO. The UK has consistently said if it's to be successful, PESCO must be designed in a way that strengthens the relationship with NATO. It's nothing to do with Europe, you understand, Mike. This is to do with NATO. And it promotes an open and competitive European defence industry. Well, this is a complete lie. And we showed a week or so ago that here was the MBDA company, which was a European company that had simply scooped up all the national defence capability. So that first paragraph of the letter is a downright lie. Then it goes into the fact that all of this has received parliamentary scrutiny. So don't think this has been done in secret because everybody knows about it. Well, that's absolute spin. And then down at the bottom, what have we got? We're defending 2010 and the Lancaster House Treaty and saying, well, of course, everybody knew about this because it's been the subject of parliamentary scrutiny. Don't worry. So that whole area was deceit. This letter trying to say, no, everything is quite fine. Don't you worry your little head about what's going on. And sorry,
no, it's okay. Well, I was just going to say parliamentary scrutiny, and then they list some links which are about ministerial statements. Those weren't discussions or debates or votes about whether we should do this or not. No, this was a statement. We have done this.
Yeah, and it was all done behind closed doors, a lot of it in the residence of the British ambassador in Paris. We get on to page 2. The first paragraph is making excuses for British troops wearing the European emblem. And it tries to defuse that at one stage by saying, well, of course, this sort of thing is done with the blue badge of the blueberries of the United Nations, but they are at least claiming to be peacekeeping forces, whereas this is branding directly into the EU military. And then we've got a lot of excuses about Afghanistan and the threat from ISIS fighters. The author of this letter says, I draw your attention to the distinction between the Defence Secretary's quote and the Independent's headline for its own article. But we need all these troops doing what they're doing to defend us against these terrorists who live in caves and are going to attack the whole of the Western world. This is the article that they're referring to, and the headline, ISIS fighters in Afghanistan are communicating with UK terror cells, Defence Secretary Gavin Williamson says. Of course, there's no evidence for that presented in the article, and we haven't seen any evidence for it in any case. But now we've got a new problem alongside ISIS and Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, and that is ISK, Khorasan. So we've now got a nice new acronym which we can bamboozle the British public with. And this is what Gavin said. What we see is a real threat posed by these groups to the UK, and we've got to be acting as we are to ensure we do not see future Manchester-style attacks. We consistently see terrorist groups operating here in Afghanistan, and evidence of their links back not just to the UK, but also to the whole of Europe. And we are in there training troops because those are the people who are going to stop these very naughty terrorists from attacking us.
I noticed that you've labelled that Gavin Williamson, Defence Secretary, and brackets left in photo. You weren't sure whether people would...
It's just to prevent any confusion there, Mike, because it's such a lovely photograph. So come back into this document. That was the paragraph we were talking about there, highlighted. But this is something else which caught my eye. Who wrote this letter? We have no idea who wrote it. So we've got a letter from unaccountable persons, anonymous. They're in a position of power, but we don't know who they are.
And but we do know that they're from the Joint Unit on Euro-Atlantic Security Policy. So the question then is, what is this Joint Unit on Euro-Atlantic Security Policy? And I suspect many people don't know, so let's find out. Well, back in 2016, Lord Bonas asked the question. It was a written question to ask Her Majesty's Government whether the Joint Euro-Atlantic Security Policy Unit, which was referred to in the National Security Strategy and Strategic Defence and Security Review 2015, has been formed, and what its future role is anticipated to be when the UK leaves the EU. Well, that was answered by Baroness Ainley. And she said the Joint Unit on Euro-Atlantic Security Policy was launched on 18th of October 2016. Foreign and Commonwealth Office and Ministry of Defence colleagues are now co-located as a single team, leading the government's work on NATO policy, the EU's common security and defence policy, and conventional arms control in Europe. So this is the group, Brian, that is leading us into EU Defence Union, because they are absolutely handling the government's work on EU's common security and defence policy. But let's have a look and see what the National Security Strategy and Strategic Defence and Security Review 2015 said, because this is not the only sort of joint body which was established. So we have the Euro-Atlantic Security Policy Unit, we have the International Counter-Terrorism Strategy Unit, we have Arms Control and Counter-Proliferation Centre, we have the Exports Controls Unit, we have the Gulf Strategy Unit, the UN Peacekeeping Unit, and the National Security Vetting Services Unit. So these are the 7 units that were established, these cross-department units. Well, let's have a look at one, the International Counter-Terrorism Strategy. Well, this is the Home Office and the Foreign and Commonwealth Office that created the Joint Unit for International Counter-Terrorism Strategy. It's led by a senior official from the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, Jane Marriott. It reports to both the Foreign Secretary and the Home Secretary, and it works closely with the UK's domestic and foreign intelligence agencies, the Security Service MI5 and the Secret Intelligence Service MI6, as well as SO15, which is the Metropolitan Police's Counter-Terrorism Command. So what we're looking at here, Brian, is the fusion doctrine. If you remember, this is something which, although this policy was created under David Cameron, this fusion doctrine was announced by Theresa May in the National Security Capability Review this year. And if you remember, this is all about building a culture of common purpose across departments. It requires improved accountability to shift incentives and behaviours towards a more genuinely whole-of-government approach.
This is the Soviet. I find this, the language and the style of what's happening here, Soviet, in my book, is the right description. Alex, correct me, please, but we're seeing something immensely dangerous. This is democracy long gone in UK.
Soviet's the correct word, Brian, because the Soviet model was to issue kind of thoughts for the day or directives, lines to take, which they called temniki. And I think now that this is the definition, or this is the practice of what common purpose as a charity, political charity, and when you spell it lowercase, also the culture of common purpose, I think we now understand that that is what is meant, that everyone has the same line to take regardless of their institutional or even national affiliations. And the 7 items spun out of the 2015 counter-terrorism, or sorry, security strategy, which Mike put on screen, might look very dry to people with no background in this, but all 7 of them are characterized by being issues in which the Foreign Office, the Home Office, the Ministry of Defence, the Department for Trade and Industry, when it existed, all had very different takes, which of course is part of the balance and the checks and balances and the division of power within the executive. Different ministries took their own views based on their own information and officers. Of course, this led to some confusion, particularly in the Thatcher era, when, as Gerald James has written better than anyone else in his book In the Public Interest, exporting went wrong and was used as a front for arms sales to people who shouldn't have got arms. But there was a healthy diversity of opinion. And all the 7 issues that you put, or points of the strategy which Mike put up, have in common now that there is only one body behind government departments, i.e. it's being controlled by civil servants and even advisors who are maybe not in the civil service, and private individual and corporations are setting the line for the whole of Her Majesty's government to take. So it's not parliamentarians of either house that are setting this policy now, nor is it even civil service people wearing the hat of the expert on the area or the country or the theme involved. It is a couple of people coming out of a faceless commission taking advice from who's special interests, really. So I think that is what common purpose as a catchword means now. I think we've cracked it. It means the line for the whole of the officials to take on something.
Yeah. Very serious. We'll stay on the case, certainly of the common purpose culture. But if you're running a Soviet in the United Kingdom under the Conservative Party, then of course you need your propaganda machine. And I'm going to say a very big thank you to the person who pointed me to this. It's the list Brexit. And this is website and information put together by a lady. And here she's homing in on the BBC. Very detailed, a lot of really good research. Some of this UK column is covered before, but a lot of information is new here and it's been presented extremely well. So I'm going to encourage people to look at it. What we're really saying is that the BBC tells the lie. It's independent, and of course we should trust it as a publicly funded broadcaster. But as we get into the detail, we see more and more information which shows us that the BBC is not what it claims to be. So in the financial year 13-14, the BBC took 878,000, 14-15, 778,000. This is all money coming in from the European Union. So in 2015, the BBC was given 19 million, over 19 million euros. 2016, 6 million. These are big sums of money, Mike, coming in from a foreign political power, which must have an impact on what the BBC says.
Do we know if this is additional money to its 3.7 billion British funded budget, or is this within that budget?
I believe it's within, but right. We only got this information this morning, so we've still got some work to do on it. So 2017, they received EU funding of 12 million euros as of the 31st of March 2018, and it goes. This is talking about BBC Media Action as well, which I found this particularly good. Let's remind ourselves about BBC Media Action, and of course, one of the things that they're doing now is boasting of their collaboration with big corporations. They got the Corporate Leaders Group, and if you're a big company, you can buy meetings with BBC News correspondents. I wonder what could be achieved in those meetings. Yes. with good food and wine. And at the same time, of course, BBC Media Action was boasting that it was helping Syrians to get a sense of national identity through drama. I'm going to say just very quickly, Alex, the BBC is just such a vile organisation for the hypocrisy, the spin and the lies. This goes very well with the type of government that's installing itself.
Oh, there's a lot of crossover between the two and the same styles of people. If you hang around outside the BBC's offices in White City and see the darlings coming out and how they meet in cabals and plan things, it looks very, very similar to how things are done in Whitehall, actually. There seems to be quite a seamless carousel between the two. And this goes back to the post-war years, really, or even the interwar years, the idea of technocracy. These people do see themselves as a class apart from the population.
Yeah. Well, we're going to stay on the trail of the BBC. If anybody's got more information about the European finance coming into the BBC, we would like to know. Let's end on the subject of ICSA, the UK's supposed investigation into child abuse. We are happy to say live on air that there is no doubt this inquiry is an utter scam. And the reason we feel confident in saying that is because the inquiry has reported to an individual in an email that they don't need the testimony of Melanie Shaw because we've already heard from others in Beechwood. We've got a general idea what went on because we've already spoken to some people who were abused at Beechwood. So we really don't need to hear what Melanie Shaw says. So the inquiry said it was going to get the truth out about people who'd been abused and survived that abuse, but now the truth is coming out. All they're really doing is getting a little flavour so that they can manipulate things, but they are prepared to hear what this man had to say. The Nottinghamshire Post or Nottinghamshire Live here reporting that one of the Beechwood bosses said, well, in the time I was there, we never saw any abuse. There was never any abuse, Mike. They were there for 3 decades. And Baroness J said, well, this is a little bit surprising, but not to worry because the people running the home where the abuse was taking place, they didn't see any abuse. You want to laugh at this, Mike, but the subject is so serious, but it is a scam. And of course, we can expect a document to come out in due course when nobody has been found guilty of anything, a few lessons to learn, carry on as normal.
Alex, before we go, I've just got one thing to ask, and I want to get some response from you to the news that Christopher Steele, the alleged former MI6 agent, has been put on Vanity Fair's influential people list. And my question to you is this how it's going to be, that we're going to have spooks or ex-spooks becoming celebrities?
He wouldn't be top of my list of celebrity spooks, put it that way. He was not a very popular man in the section, and even among his own colleagues. I'm not going to start slinging mud at him, but I have some serious questions about things he did. And for Vanity Fair, which, as the very name implies, referring to Thackeray's novel, is about all the light momentary distractions that people in the upper classes like to have to titillate them. For them to be taking him on suggests very much that it is a darling of the chattering classes. Isn't he an interesting character? Look at what he's done, and of course, at the root of this is he has helped us to bring down Trump and all the things we don't like. Yeah. And of course, Brexit is in the pie there. So you could find some of this spookery coming out. It's already happening through the angle of cybersecurity, because of the issue of attributability is always uncertain in cyber. So if you club together, as NATO nowadays is doing, or the joint the fusion doctrine is having this joint attribution as well with chemical weapons incidents, then that's a great way of saying that the Russians did it, or whoever the flavor of the month is. And so I think starting with cybersecurity, which is the angle in which Steele came to the fore, although he's not his expertise, but that's how he was dragged into it with the dossier issue. This is going to widen, and we are actually going to find that the government, which insists that spooks sign the Official Secrets Act and never say anything again, is actually the entity which is putting some of its favourite golden boys of espionage up on a pedestal for the media to consume. I should also correct something I said earlier, which was wrong. It wasn't the Prodi European Commission which resigned because of massive corruption. It was the predecessor Jacques Santerre Commission, and the Prodi Commission took over early as a caretaker commission as a result of that.
Okay.
All right. Alex, thank you very much for joining us. Good to have you back again. We'd like to say thank you to all our viewers and listeners. Thank you to those that have made donations recently. If you're not a subscriber of UK Column and you like what we do, please subscribe. We will be back
on Friday.
Thanks for joining us. Bye-bye.